Welcome back. We are landing this whole thing on the hardest part now. This episode is about trauma, rebuilding, and why magic became survival for him. And honestly, the therapy angle is what hit me the hardest. Because the man is talking about losing the version of himself that everybody knew. That line about magic being a feeling, not a trick, is huge. Wait, because that reframes everything, right? He is not saying, look at my card trick. He is saying, look at what changes inside you. Exactly. And then he turns it on himself and says he could not even do that for himself. That is brutal. That is the whole thing, though, when your job is joy and you cannot access joy. And then therapy becomes not some luxury, but a lifeline. The crazy part is he said paying for it was stressing him out even more, which is the most expensive form of healing imaginable. Right, healing with a monthly subscription and emotional tax. But that therapist giving it for free changed the whole arc. Like, imagine one person quietly deciding, I am not letting this man sink. That kind of kindness is almost a plot twist. It really is, and then the sonic reset thing came up too. That part sounded like someone sold him a sci-fi sleep ritual. He is basically listening to organized noise and calling it peace. But if it calms your mind and helps you sleep, who cares what it sounds like? People love to mock anything that sounds strange until it works. Especially when you are desperate enough to try anything. The AA book thing surprised me more, honestly, because he is not even the obvious audience for it. He has never touched alcohol, which is a wild detail in this whole story. But that is why it works, because the book is really about patterns and surrender. Not just drinking, not just addiction, but the bigger chaos underneath. Trauma, grief, powerlessness, all of it. And he basically says he found his own 12 steps in that process. That is the real thing people miss. He did not copy the book mechanically. He used it as a map, then walked his own road. Which is how actual recovery usually looks, messy and personal. The mother stuff got very real, very fast. Yeah, because this is where the childhood pain stops being abstract. You can feel the resentment without him even trying to perform it. He is basically saying, I wanted my mom to be happy, but I paid for it. That is such a devastating sentence. And the fact he moved in with his grandparents at 15 says everything. Kids do not usually leave home that early unless something is really broken. The racism around him made it worse because he was already the outsider. Then you add adult men being horrible to him and it becomes ugly fast. And he is not even exaggerating it, he is describing the pattern. That is what made the attachment conversation hit so hard. Because the idea that we chase familiar love even when it hurts is so uncomfortable. Humans really do collect damage like it is a family heirloom. That is such a dark way to say it, but unfortunately, yes. And the scary part is how normal that cycle sounds once someone explains it clearly. Familiar can feel safe, even when it is absolutely not safe. That is why his forgiveness conversation with his mom matters so much. He is not saying she was perfect. He is saying she was trapped too. That distinction matters. It changes the whole moral framing from blame to understanding. Not excusing, just understanding. Which is usually the hardest emotional upgrade to make. And then he goes into powerlessness, which is where the story gets even bigger. He is basically saying illness kept ambushing him when he felt strongest. That is such a horrible psychological pattern because it trains you to fear success. Like every time you get momentum, life swings at you. Eventually you start believing the swing is the truth. And then the most powerful sentence in the whole thing was that he was looking for magic in the wrong place. Because the place he finally found it was other people. That is so beautiful and so humbling. He spent years being the source, then learned he also needed to receive. That is rare, especially for someone with that kind of public persona. Then the grand return becomes less about fame and more about repair. Which is why the buried alive thing is so insane and so symbolic. Wait, he is literally using an alive burial to kill the old identity? That is what he is saying, yeah, the Dynamo version has to die with his Nan. That is heavy. And weirdly, it makes emotional sense even though it sounds terrifying. Like as a concept, it is horrifying, but as closure, I get it. Nothing says healing like a live burial on television. That sentence should not be funny, but here we are. He is trying to make the ending physically undeniable. You cannot half commit to that metaphor, it is all in. And that is why the courage feels real, not staged. He is not escaping the pain, he is walking straight into it. Then he pivots back into live magic, and that part was pure chaos. The card trick was a flex, obviously. The signed card and coin through the pack was ridiculous. He was still doing the whole thing while everyone was losing their minds. But that red string bit was actually the most interesting one to me, because he turned an emotional idea into something physical in front of them. That is the real trick, honestly. And then the ice from fire moment was just pure theater. It is such a magician move to make physics feel rude. But it all circles back to the same point. Imagination is still powerful. He is proving he can still create wonder while being honest about collapse. That combination is why people will care. Not because he is invincible, but because he is visibly human. And maybe that is the final lesson here, right? You do not need to be fixed to be useful to other people. You just need to keep moving toward the truth. That is a perfect place to land this series, honestly. We came for the magic and left with therapy, grief, and a live burial. Classic podcast behavior. But seriously, what a run this has been. Huge respect to him for telling it this honestly. And respect to everyone listening who stayed with the whole story. Some stories do not end neatly, they just leave you thinking differently. This one definitely does that. We will see you on the next one. Welcome back. We are closing out this one with magic, trauma, and identity falling apart in real time. And somehow it ends with a man burying his old self alive on television. That is not a normal sentence, but here we are. What hit me first was him saying magic is a feeling, not just tricks. That is such a clean definition because then it becomes about wonder, not performance. Also, it is kind of brutal when the guy giving everybody joy cannot access it himself. That line lands because it is not poetic, it is painful. And he was honest about therapy being expensive, which people skip over. That part makes me mad, honestly, because help should not be luxury pricing. Imagine being depressed and getting a bill for healing. That is the most modern nightmare I have heard all week. But then the therapist offering free sessions changes the whole temperature of the story. That is the magic he was talking about, not the stage stuff. Do you notice how often his healing came through other people showing up properly? Yeah, and that completely flips the usual self-made hero fantasy. We love pretending resilience is a solo sport, which is nonsense. The internet loves a lone wolf arc until somebody actually needs community. His mother's story was the hardest part for me. Not because she was the villain, but because nobody was really winning there. Exactly, it was loss layered on loss, and he ended up carrying all of it. That resentment made sense, even if it was messy. And the racist environment matters so much, because that shapes the whole home. Right. It was not just a bad stepdad situation, it was a hostile world around it. That is why the attachment piece gets so real here. People keep thinking they will grow toward healthy love because they know pain. But familiarity is a trap, and it feels like safety even when it is not. That was maybe the smartest moment in the whole conversation. He basically admitted he had to relearn what love even looked like. And that is bigger than forgiveness, honestly. Forgiveness gets treated like a one-line fix, and it is never that. If it were that easy, every family dinner would be sponsored by closure. That is a terrible product idea and also probably profitable. The 12-step book angle surprised me the most. Not because he was an alcoholic, but because he treated the structure like a recovery map. He was basically saying trauma needs language, steps, and repetition. That is why those books hit people outside addiction, too. It gives you a rhythm when your mind is chaos. And the spiritual part is interesting because he is not preaching religion. He is saying you need something bigger than ego to survive some seasons. Which is hard for public figures because ego is basically the job description. Especially a magician, where the whole brand is, look at me, I control reality. Then life humiliates you and reminds you that you do not control much at all. That humility seemed to be the turning point for him. Like the power was never in being untouchable. It was in asking for help. Which is so hard for people from working-class backgrounds to hear, and also necessary. That whole keep calm and carry on thing can become emotional neglect with better branding. Emotional neglect with a nice accent on it. Extremely British suffering, very efficient. But I loved that he wanted his return to mean something for other people, not just him. He was basically saying, if my name opens doors, let it open doors for conversations too. That is a real redefinition of fame. Not access for ego, access for service. And then the burial idea, man, that is the most extreme closure ritual ever. Burying the old identity alive on live TV is absolutely wild. That is so dramatic that it circles back to genius. But symbolically, it makes sense if the name became a prison. Sometimes you do need to funeral for the version of you that survived. The Nan piece made it feel even more final, like the end of an era and a family line. Yeah, that one hurt because it was never just a stage name. It was childhood, public pressure, illness, grief, and ambition all packed into one identity. No wonder he had to physically ritualize the ending. What did you make of the card tricks at the end, though? That was such a perfect pivot back into joy after all the heaviness. And the thing is, he did not perform like a guy trying to prove something. He performed like someone reclaiming an old language. That is why the tricks felt emotional, not just impressive. Because by then, the magic was trust, attention, and play. Also, watching him destroy everyone with a coin and some string was rude, completely unfair to the laws of physics and to my self-esteem. But I think that is the full circle here, right? He lost the magic when life got too heavy, and found it through people again. Not by pretending the pain never happened, but by going through it honestly. That is the whole lesson, and it is a brutal one. You do not rebuild identity by polishing the old story. You rebuild it by burying what cannot survive with you, and then making room for something stranger, kinder, and hopefully lighter. Preferably with fewer hospital bills and fewer life-altering surprises. That is a strong place to end this series, honestly. Yeah, because it was never just about a magician. It was about what happens when the persona breaks and the person has to begin. And that is where the real story lives. Thanks for riding through the whole run with us genuinely. We started with spectacle and ended in human beings, which is about right. We will see you on the next one. Welcome back. This is the part where the mask stops working and the person shows up. He is talking about trauma, identity loss, and rebuilding from absolute rubble. And the wild thing is, he keeps calling it magic, not performance. That distinction changes everything, honestly. Because if magic is a feeling, then the real work is emotional, not technical. That line hit me hard, where he says he could not put a smile on his own face. That is brutal because you spend your life giving people wonder. Then your own life becomes the one place with no trick left. And he did not say that like a dramatic quote either. He said it like somebody who had lived through the collapse. What I found interesting is how practical the healing sounded. Right, because people expect some mystical turnaround, and it is therapy bills and daily routines. Yeah, the most spiritual thing in the room was a paid therapy invoice. That is modern healing, expensive and repetitive. But then the therapist steps in for free and suddenly it is human, not transactional. That part felt bigger than the magic tricks. Because kindness became the thing that rewired him. Which is annoying because it is not flashy at all. But that is the point, right? The thing that saves you usually does not look cinematic while it is happening. Even that audio therapy idea was strange in a very believable way. Sonic reset therapy sounds like something a tech startup invented in a panic. And yet he is using it to sleep like a normal person. That is what recovery often is. Weird tools that work enough to matter. Then the AA book thing really surprised me. Because he has never drunk, never done drugs, and still found the book useful. Which tells you those steps were really about trauma, shame, and surrender. That idea of replacing addiction with grief was so smart. It is like he found a template for pain. And honestly, people hate that word because it sounds clinical. But templates can save you when your life is too chaotic to invent a path. The family part was the hardest section for me. That resentment toward his mom is so complicated it almost hurts to hear it out loud. Because he is not saying she was evil, he is saying she was trapped too. That is what makes it sad, not simple. And the way he connects that to his father being gone makes it even heavier. Once the father disappears, the whole emotional architecture shifts. Then new men enter the house and the child is supposed to just adapt. Meanwhile, the kid is reading danger before anybody else admits it is there. The racism piece matters there too, because it is not just family dysfunction. It is also a mixed-race kid trying to survive a hostile environment. And then he has to interpret cruelty from adults as normal life. That is how people get their first model of love, unfortunately. That whole discussion about familiar love versus safe love was sharp. Familiar is such a sneaky liar. It really is because it feels like home even when it is on fire. And that is why people repeat patterns instead of escaping them. Safety can feel foreign if chaos is what raised you. I liked that he did not moralize his mother either. He moved from blame to understanding, which is much harder. Forgiveness becomes less about excusing and more about surviving your own memory. Then we get to the real pivot. He says he felt powerless for years. That is the most honest sentence in the whole thing. Because a public person admitting helplessness is still rare. People assume visibility equals control, and it absolutely does not. Especially when illness keeps interrupting the climb. He keeps saying it hits when he is flying high, which is such a cruel pattern. That makes the body feel almost like an enemy with timing issues. Then he flips the whole idea of magic. He stops looking for magic inside himself and starts seeing it in other people. That is a beautiful correction. Also a humbling one, because ego hates that answer. But that is the adult answer, not the poster answer. And honestly, it explains why the return feels different. He is not coming back to prove he can still do it. He is coming back because the work became impossible without it. That is why the show title lands so hard. Dynamo is dead sounds dramatic until you realize it is therapeutic. He literally buried the old identity to make room for the person underneath. Which is terrifying, because identity is not a jacket you just take off. It is your career, your story, your safety net, your ego, everything. So killing that name is a real grief, not a branding stunt. I kept thinking about how much courage it takes to not just survive, but rename yourself emotionally. And he even says the cleansing is scarier than the stunt. Which is hilarious and depressing because that tells you everything. Fear of performance is one thing. Fear of becoming yourself is another. That is the most human sentence in the episode, honestly. And then the little magic demo at the end is such a perfect reminder. Cards, thread, coin, ice, all of it is basically a language of wonder. He is out here doing emotional recovery, and then casually stealing your reality. The red thread thing was insane, because it turns inner pain into something visible, touchable, almost undeniable. That is what great magic does, really. It makes the invisible feel temporarily physical. And that mirrors the interview itself, where pain becomes speakable. Which is why the whole thing matters beyond fandom. He is showing people from working-class, guarded backgrounds that asking for help is not weakness. That part probably lands hardest in places where silence is treated like strength. Because so many people are basically trained to swallow everything and keep moving. And then we act surprised when they break in private. He is offering a different model. Be broken, ask, rebuild. Which is simple to say and brutally hard to live. But if a public figure can say it plainly, somebody else might actually hear it. That is probably why people keep saying these stories save lives. Not because they are perfect, but because they are recognizable. You hear your own hidden sentence inside somebody else's confession. That is a wild thing to be grateful for, but it is true. And that is kind of where we have landed across this whole series. Not on spectacle, but on survival with the lights still on. Which is a much better story than just, look, a famous magician. It is a story about what it costs to keep becoming a person. And maybe that is the real trick all along. You do not vanish this pain, you learn how to live after it. That feels like a good place to leave it. Thanks for being with us through the whole run, genuinely. This one started with a performer and ended with a person finding his footing. We will catch you on the next one. Welcome back. This one gets into the real rebuild, trauma, identity, and why magic became survival. He is not just talking about tricks anymore, he is talking about losing the name that held his whole life together. And that part is wild, because the stage name was basically the armor. When the armor goes, you suddenly have to meet yourself with nothing on. That is the painful genius of this conversation. He keeps turning the show into a mirror. And then he says magic is just putting a smile on someone's face, which is annoyingly profound. Right, because if he cannot smile himself, the whole premise collapses. Which is a brutal business model for a magician, by the way. Bro, imagine selling wonder while privately running on fumes. But that is exactly why the therapy part lands so hard, because it is not polished. The free therapist thing was huge, not because it was noble, but because someone actually noticed he needed help. That kind of kindness can change the whole emotional weather of a person. And then there is the book recommendation, which sounds random until you realize it is really a map for broken people. The irony of an Alcoholics Anonymous book helping a teetotal magician is kind of perfect. Because the point was never alcohol, it was surrender and pattern breaking. Exactly, and he keeps saying the magic is in other people now, not in his own ego. That is such a hard lesson for anyone who built an identity around being exceptional. The family stuff is where it gets even heavier, because the resentment toward his mother is so human. Not cartoon villain resentment, just that ugly mix of love, abandonment, and complicated survival. And the way he links that to familiar love patterns is uncomfortable because it rings true. People really do chase what feels known, even when it hurts them. That is the maddening part. The nervous system can mistake damage for safety. And he is saying that out loud without dressing it up, which is why it hits so hard. Then he goes from that straight into burying Dynamo alive, and I mean, come on. That is not a career pivot. That is a funeral with production value. But it makes sense because he is not trying to escape the past, he is trying to close it. And the sacrifice is the point, not the stunt. That line between cleansing and spectacle is what keeps it interesting. Also, the magic in the room was insane, like he switched from confession to impossible in one breath. The card work, the signed card, the coin through the deck, all of it was ridiculous. He basically said, fine, you want proof I am back, then watch this. And that red string bit was such a perfect metaphor because it turned emotion into something physical. That is the whole episode, really, making the invisible feel real. It is why the return matters, not because he is famous, but because he is honest. And honestly, that is what people need right now. Wonder that does not lie to them. So if this series did anything, I hope it reminded people that reinvention is expensive but possible, and that surviving yourself is sometimes the first real trick. Thanks for riding through the whole series with us. We will catch you on the next one, and hopefully with a little less emotional damage.